Hi, and welcome.
Thank you.
Let me make everybody in this entire, we call it congregation, feel like an underachiever. Stacey Abrams is the former minority leader of the Georgia State Legislature, a two-time gubernatorial candidate, the first black woman to be on the ballot for a major party as a Democrat. A founder of Fair Fight Action to boost voter registration and a fierce defender of democracy. Senior counsel for Rewiring America, an electrification nonprofit. A lecturer as the inaugural Ronald W. Walters Chair for Race and Black Politics at Howard University. A board trustee of the LBJ Foundation. And, apropos to her being here, the best-selling author who has written at least 15 books. I lost count, frankly. Fiction and nonfiction alike, including her latest novel, Rogue Justice. So, a sequel for those who have loved the thriller genre of While Justice Sleeps. So, let's start with you as an author. One of the many things on your resume. Your editor at Doubleday, Stacey, has said of you, you have tempered expectations when a high-profile person wants to be an author. But when I first started reading Stacey's work, I realized she is as much a writer as anyone I've ever worked with. That's high praise, and yet you've never taken a single writing course. So how did you learn to write?
So I am the daughter of a librarian and a storyteller. So my mom was a college librarian for the first 15 years of my life. And by the way, I need to acknowledge my little sister, Janine Abrams McLean. Also a UT alum. She did science, whatever. But our mom was a librarian, so when I was growing up, my parents couldn't afford daycare. So there was an on-site daycare at the college where she worked, but the daycare ended before her job did. And so they would bring us back to the library, myself and my older sister and one of my younger sisters, and we would sleep in the stacks. So I literally used to sleep with books and would wake up surrounded by them. My dad and my mom would read to us all the time, and she read just an incredibly wide range of things to us and encouraged us to read. My father is dyslexic. He grew up dyslexic in segregated Mississippi in the 1950s, and they didn't diagnose learning disabilities then, so they just told him he was stupid. But my dad had this just extraordinary imagination, this amazing oral memory, and a capacity for storytelling that when you're a kid, they call it lying. When you're older, it's called being a raconteur. Or fabulist. But my dad would tell us these amazing stories. He worked at a shipyard, and so on Fridays when he would get home, we knew Friday nights we would have story time. So my dad would put us to bed and he'd tell us a story. And it was like the cleanest version of Game of Thrones ever. Because I'm one of 6 kids, and my dad would have to tell a story, and he'd have to remember what he said the week before, add things on for each audience member, the 6 of us, whatever we wanted. And this would be a story that had knights and dragons and fairies and dinosaurs, I mean, all in the same story. So he would have to weave all of this together. And so I grew up with this very rich love of storytelling, but also with a respect for the architecture of a book. And I spent a lot of time really trying to understand, how do you take what my dad would do orally and what my mom really imbued us with, this respect for the written word, and bring them together.
But you've written all different kinds of books. You've written nonfiction books, you've written children's books, you've written romance novels, you've written thrillers. Those are different genres. How, Stacey, do you go from one to the other?
The foundations of good storytelling are true no matter what you're doing. So whether you are writing a book or giving speech, teaching a course, writing an article, the foundations of storytelling. You have to explain the problem, complicate the problem, and solve the problem. And so in every good book that you've read, that's what they do. The books that you got really irritated with and put it down and you come back 7 to 12 years later, it's because they created a problem and then they either don't complicate the problem or they just keep creating the same complication and you get frustrated with it. And then the books where you throw it across the room at the end because you're like, why is this how it ends? It's because when they solved the problem, they weren't true to what the story told you was going to happen. And we all know what book that is, and please don't let it be mine. And so for me, the architecture of telling a story it does not care about genre. The architecture is the same. The challenge, though, is to respect the reader of those different genres, of those different stories. And so when I'm writing children's books, I have to remember who's my audience and what does it take to tell an effective children's story. How do you take this very big concept and not reduce it, but condense it? And that's different. When you're being reductive, you are treating the reader, a child, as less than. When you're condensing it, you recognize that you've got to tell a really rich story in a really short period of time. When you're writing a thriller, the reader expects to be excited, challenged, scared, and to find resolution. And when you're writing a romance, somebody has to fall in love at the end. The issue is how long does it take them to get there and who dies on the way when I write it.
In order to be a good writer, you also have to be a good reader. So what thrillers have you read? What authors of thrillers have you read that have inspired you?
So I read everything except for horror. That's the only genre I don't like being scared. I don't understand why people do. I'm in politics, that's enough. And so, I've met actual monsters, I don't need to read about them. But for the rest of it, I really love good stories that excite you. So John Grisham, of course, when I started thinking about legal thrillers, but Victor Hugo is one of the best thriller writers. I love his work. I love Nora Roberts, who's a romance novelist who is one of the best storytellers ever. Octavia Butler, who writes fantastical, and so I don't think about the genre in terms of the writers I respect, because if I'm doing my job, I'm pulling from the best of all of those. But I do read within a genre that I write because I know that readers come expecting something. I'm not going to give them everything they expect, and I'll give them some things they don't expect, but I respect what they're expecting, and that's a lot of act. But I try to be very conscious of the conditions that they expect to see in a story. I don't have to replicate everything they've read before, but I have to have echoes of it so that they know I understood what they were coming to the genre for.
This is the second time you have written about your protagonist, Avery Keene, who is a Supreme Court clerk and an amateur detective who gets wound up in these conspiracies that threaten our national security. A very, very interesting character. Before we talk about those plots, how did you conceive Avery Keene?
So the genesis of the first novel, I was having lunch with someone who becomes familiar in the book. Her name is Teresa Roseborough. Teresa's a real person. She was the senior partner at the law firm where I practiced when I was an attorney. And when I left and began what my mother refers to as my trajectory of downward economic mobility, I left the law firm and went to work for the city of Atlanta. And so because she knew I was making less money, she would occasionally feed me. And we were having lunch one day, and we were talking about just interesting legal theories, and she pointed something out to me. And it was this issue in the Constitution. And so when I started writing the very first pages of the book, it was based on this character, Justice Wynne. And I thought, the issue at hand was that you needed someone who had responsibility but no authority. And because I was going to ground this in the Supreme Court, who in that space has the most responsibility and the least amount of authority? And it's something we all saw in real time with the leaking of the Dobbs decision, that there are folks who are behind the scenes that we will never see and never know, who have access to information that changes our lives. And so I needed a character who had the intellectual heft to navigate these questions, had the street smarts to legitimately and sort of figure out how to solve for it, and who had a conscience. Because I'm not a fan of books where the hero is the hero because they had no choice. I want you to choose heroism. I want you to make the conscious decision to do right, especially when you know you don't have to. And so for me, Avery was about creating a character who had all of those pieces, and ultimately, because of who she was and how she came into this question, she was going to choose to do right. She wasn't always going to do it right, but she was going to choose to do right. And that was the other piece. I wanted someone who was fallible, not in the sort of broken way, because there's this current sort of anti-hero thread where good people have to be fundamentally broken. And I don't think that's necessary. You do have to be dinged up. You do have to be dented, but you don't have to be broken to be good. And so that was the other piece of what I wanted for her.
But she's battling some deep problems in her personal life. How do you develop her backstory? How did you conceive of the challenges that she faces as your protagonist?
I mean, I make a lot of stuff up, but so I wanted to ground Avery's story without giving too much away. So her mom appears early on. Her mother battles addiction, and that is something that is real in my family. I have a younger brother who I've talked about very publicly, who has battled addiction most of his adult life. And part of making a choice, Walter will always battle addiction, but he has to choose each day how he's going to confront that addiction. And so I wanted her decision-making to be grounded in having watched someone not always make that right decision. Her father passed away when she was younger, and so there's also something very isolating about these challenges. And in a thriller, you want your hero to have supports, but to really ultimately have to be self-reliant. And so part of it was, how do I make sure she doesn't have someone else she can just turn to? But then I wanted to make sure I surrounded her with people that she chose as her support system. And so each of those pieces are based on my life. Some of my dearest friends who when I'm making big and terrible decisions, like, who do I call? Who has the most utility? And I wanted her to have people who brought different things to who she was. Because the other part of writing a good character is, if your character is fully formed by the time you're writing the story gets boring really fast. We've all read those characters who are just absolutely perfect. Congratulations to them. The fun ones are the ones where you watch their growth. You don't know if they're going to make the right choice. You don't know if their stumble is going to be a stumble, or if they're going off, down a step or off a cliff. And so I wanted someone who we could root for and worry about. And that was the other part of building in her backstory.
So the conspiracies at the heart of these books reach the highest level of government. To what extent are you working these things out because you have the fears about the fragility of our own system and the fallibility of our own leaders?
Oh, absolutely. Like, everything I write about is possible, but not always probable. So while Justice sleeps, the lunch I had with Teresa, she said, "Stacy, have you ever thought about the fact that the Constitution provides for the 25th Amendment? So if we have a president who is incapable of doing the job, we can replace that person. If you've got someone in Congress who is incapable of doing their job, you can just vote them out after 2 or 6 years. You can impeach them. But for just inability to do the job, not someone who's committed a crime, just unable to do the job, there is no provision for judges." It's still not true. It's still true. Like, there's nothing in the Constitution. You can only remove a judge, a federal judge, who is the only person in the Constitution with a lifetime appointment There is no provision for removing that person simply for being unable to do the job. They can be removed for high crimes, misdemeanor, or death. Anything else, oh well. So because I have a very fantastical imagination and I'm my father's daughter, I got in my car, left there, was listening to the story about someone who had fallen into a persistent vegetative state, and I thought, ooh, what if a Supreme Court justice who was the swing vote lapsed into a coma? And then I thought, well, what case could be so important? And I thought, what if the President of the United States was involved in some nefarious international scheme? And what if that international scheme required the Supreme Court to weigh in and the justice who was the swing vote was in a coma? I wrote this in 2010 and nobody would buy it. I kid you not. My agent shared it with some publishers, and what they said is, no president would ever be involved in that. It's just too ridiculous. And then they said, nobody cares about the Supreme Court. So, possible, not probable. And then, so I put it away for 10 years, and, around 2019, things started looking a little different around here. And so I was able to sell the book. And so the new one, so Rogue Justice, I spent a lot of time, so my youngest, so there are 6 of us. I have a sister, Leslie, who's a federal judge. She went to a judicial conference. I owed my editor a plot for the next book. And she was at my house, and I was looking through her judicial conference program. It was stultifyingly boring. Like, oh my God. Like, you spent 5 days listening to this? But as I'm flipping through, there was something in there, and it mentioned the FISA court. And we all talked about FISA back when, right after 9/11, and then just the power of this court that's been around since the 1970s. And I thought, this is a court that has no oversight by the public. Literally, what they do is it's illegal for people to see their decisions. The average person has no access, and even the Congressional Oversight Committee with purview is restricted in what they can actually tell the public. So what if somebody was blackmailing them? So I think of what is true. I always want it to be grounded in reality, and then I try to terrify you with it. And since I'm in Texas, I also started thinking about this around the time there was this little electrical emergency and the power grid went out. Yeah, so you guys might know a little bit something. So Rogue Justice engages the conversation of, what if somebody tried to cut the power to America? Which could be done. Just not hopefully in any of the ways I prescribe, and if it does happen, I didn't do it.
I couldn't help but to notice you left the door open in Rogue Justice for another book with Avery Keene. Will we see her again?
Yes, she is due to my editor in May of 2024. So somebody tell me something you're afraid of. I'm not joking.
All right, so I just read your prodigious list of activities, your remarkable resume. When do you find time to write?
Her name is Samantha Schlossberg, who's also, you may know her from Rogue Justice. So this is my chief of staff. So basically I tell her I need X number of days to write. So I've been writing long enough. I know how many words I can write in a day. I know how many days thus it will take me to write. And so I think about how many days will I actually write, how many days will I plan to write, and just decide not to because I don't care. How many, so I build in procrastination, I build in writer's block, I build in I just don't care anymore. I hate words and stories, and I'm going to now live in a yurt somewhere. And then I ask Sam to plot those all on a calendar. I have a deadline and I work back from that deadline, and that's how I get my books written.
Let me, so we talked about the fragility of government that is reflected in your novels. It turns out our government's pretty fragile in real life too. Let me quote you from an op-ed that you wrote in the Washington Post after January 6, 2021. You said, "Our democratic system faces extraordinary threats today because of sustained attacks from Republican leaders who throw up roadblocks to voting, and among the worst actors stoke the flames of white supremacy and hyper-nationalism to cling to power. Has the Republican Party become more or less of a threat since you wrote that op-ed piece in 2021?
Yes. And I mean that there are those who witnessed the consequences of January 6th and who attempted some corrective measures. There are others who thought, well, we didn't go far enough, that's why we weren't successful. The most dangerous part, though, are those who cloak themselves in minor actions of grace to excuse major actions of malfeasance. And so when you hear the phrase, for example, election security, that is code for we're going to use your fear to make it harder for others to exercise their power. And those are the most dangerous people because they're smart. They've glommed onto the reality that people are aware that there are challenges to democracy, but they use one act of good behavior to cloak a dozen actions of not just malfeasance, but intentional diminution of our democracy. And so they use supremacy, and white supremacy is part of it, but they've widened the aperture for attack. We know that young people, regardless of race, are now the targets of voter suppression. Look at Iowa, look at look at New Hampshire. We know that communities of color that have traditionally been, if not exempt from, then considered de minimis enough that they weren't the targets, have now been pulled into the voter suppression orbit. And the reality is, when you are willing to undermine the democracy of some, you are weakening it for all. And that's the most dangerous part of the leadership that I see that continues to attack and dismantle, because they are cloaking themselves in a righteousness that is not real. But we are allowing ourselves to be distracted because we've lowered the bar and lowered our expectations to subterranean levels, and we get excited by someone just not being that bad. And not that bad is not a recommendation.
Let me quote you from that same piece.
You read way too much, but go ahead.
Democrats in Congress must fully embrace their mandate to fast-track democracy reforms that give voters a fair fight rather than allowing undemocratic systems to be used as tools and excuses to perpetrate that same system. Have we, Democrats and Republicans alike, taken proper measures to safeguard our democracy since January 6th?
And again, it is true that we have seen important fixtures be put in place. The Electoral Count Act, so that we are not arguing over whether the vice president has the right to overthrow an election. Glad we clarified that. But at the same time, here in Texas, we have seen the state take over election offices it does not like. It's done the same thing's happening in Georgia. We have seen an attempt to remove a sitting Supreme Court justice in Wisconsin because she said maybe it's a good idea for everyone to have access. Right. And so the challenge is that we are playing whack-a-mole with attacks on democracy. And the issue with whack-a-mole is that we get tired. And it's hard to see where it's popping up. So one of the things, Fair Fight is something I'm extraordinarily proud of, but I'm also proud of an organization I created called Fair Count. Janine likes to tease her that I made her quit her good government job. Stand up, Janine. So, Janine got her PhD in evolutionary biology, worked for the CDC, and is a populations expert. David Hillis, who sits beside her and has a wonderful book that you should also go and buy while you're here at the Texas Book Festival, was one of her professors. And she should be a scientist, and she is. But she's a scientist who practices her work through a group called Fair Count, because the US Census is one of the most powerful tools for democracy that nobody understands. If Fair Fight is designed to ensure the architecture of democracy, that the pieces of democracy, voting, the right to vote, access to election security, that is true, who we get to pick also matters. I don't know if you've heard about this, but there's gerrymandering about in the land. And gerrymandering has its deepest roots in undercounting populations of color, undercounting poor communities, undercounting young people. And when those communities are undercounted, they don't get the chance to vote for representation that looks like them, that reflects their values, that reflects their needs. Fair Count was created in 2019 at the same time as Fair Fight to actually make sure we had an accurate census. And it works. We just saw what happened in Alabama, what's happening in Georgia, what's happening in South Carolina, what's happened here in Texas. When we participate in democracy by being counted, then we can then use our voices and votes to count more. And so to your question, we are watching not just the attack on democracy at the voting booth, but attack on democracy at the choice level. If you don't get to pick anyone to speak for you, voting is irrelevant. If you're choosing between shoot me or stab me, that doesn't really feel like a choice. And so we want people to have real choices, and that's part of what Fair Count does. And so unfortunately, we get fixated on the last ignominy, and we ignore the next one to come. And that's part of how I write. I try to figure out what are the things we should be afraid of that have revealed themselves, and what's the next thing to come that we need to anticipate, because it's just as dangerous, and we have to be ready for it. If not to know what it is, then at least to know how to prepare and respond whenever it reveals itself.
So what is the next thing that you're seeing on the horizon now?
DEI. So when we hear about diversity, inclusion, and equity, diversity is nothing more than the belief that there are differences among us that should be respected, celebrated, and sometimes lifted up. Equity, Equity says that once those differences are revealed, that they should not be impediments to full participation, that there should be an equalization, not equal outcome, but certainly a regularity of interest in input. And that inclusion means that if we add them together and weave them in to who we are, things get better, and there's additional value, DEI. The challenge is that the impediments to the American dream come from blocking DEI. The three ways we achieve the American dream: the education, the economy, and elections. Well, we've seen the attack. I mean, again, Texas, yay y'all. Texas started with the Hopwood decision. The attacks on education are designed to diminish who has access to the American dream through education. We are watching the attacks that are happening right now. Fearless Fund, Hello Alice. NASCAR is being sued for discriminating against white men. I'm not joking. Look it up. There's a suit. And then there is the attempt to diminish the remaining pillar of the Voting Rights Act, as you and I know, Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, where it is no longer sufficient for there to be racist outcomes. You now have to prove explicit racist intention. And if they say, well, I wasn't being racist, that counts. And so what we have to understand is that the attacks on DEI, they may focus on a venture capital fund that you know nothing about, but it is all woven together, because when you can attack the legitimacy of diversity, equity, and inclusion, you are attacking the right of communities to participate fully in the American dream. And we're going to get distracted by these small whack-a-mole pieces and say, well, that's not about me. But it is, because if they can delegitimize the notion of DEI, then they can delegitimize every single tool we have in place to make access possible. So that's where we should be afraid.
Stacey, why, after January 6th and outrageous statements about trampling the Constitution in order to get him reinstalled as our president, is Donald Trump the runaway favorite for the Republican Party's presidential nomination next year?
Because even if people don't like who he is, they like what he does. I mean, that's the bottom line, that those who revile him and revile his behavior and even revile him, they got tax cuts. They had someone give voice to some of their fondest wishes. And if the collateral damage is the integrity of our nation and the infrastructure that has held us together, oh, well, they got what they wanted. And so, and I don't want to be too blithe about it. There are those for whom there is an inchoate fear of the change that is sweeping this country because of not just democracy, but cultural evolution. And that fear was given voice by this guy. Now, they may not have liked how he said it, but they wanted someone to say it. And they believe that because he was willing to do everything he was willing to do, that they can live with the collateral damage to democracy, integrity, patriotism, for the thing that they think is so important to them. Voting is a hyper-selfish act. We vote for the person we think, based on our intellectual capacity, that we think is going to do what we want. We all do it. There are those of us who do it right, but, you know. But that's what we all do. And so for many people, Donald Trump is emblematic of what they want as the outcome, and they are willing to deal with the inputs to make it so.
I want to note that we received questions from the audience, and I've baked some of those into the questions that I've asked to Stacey. But one of the questions that came in overwhelmingly is Stacey's. What can we all do to ensure that we're upholding democratic principles and bolstering our democracy? So,
the movie Everything Everywhere All at Once. Raise your hand if you saw it. Interesting movie, yes. Terrible mission statement. We cannot do everything everywhere all at once, but we can all do something somewhere soon. The reason I use that is that we think about democracy often as elections. Elections are moments in time, they're markers, but they are not the metric of the success of our democracy. I protect elections because they are the most provable points of our intention. But all of the reasons we vote are tied up in the fact that there are ills in society. There are things we think need to be better. There are things that are good that we want to have amplified, and there are things that are concerning that we want to diminish. Voting is not magic. Voting is medicine, and it's the medicine we use to treat the ills that we see. But in between taking that medicine, we still have to be out there serving as the antibodies to danger, the antibodies to those ills. And that's what each person can do. We don't all have to go and register people to vote, although you guys could use that too. But what we can all do is find the thing that animates us. What part of society matters to you the most? And what's the one thing you can do? What's the way, and it's the thing that either keeps you awake at night or wakes you up with excitement in the morning. It doesn't have to be something you're afraid of, it can be something you're excited to do. But we've got to pick that thing and then do that thing over and over and over again. That's the something. The somewhere is you don't have to do it for everyone everywhere, but figure out the place where you can do it with enough regularity that it means something to you and it means something to someone else. And then the soon is, elections are important, but they are not the ball game. That's like only showing up for the championship or only showing up in the fourth quarter. But if you weren't there in the second quarter, then we're in a lot of trouble. And so do something somewhere soon. I don't care what that something is. There's enough trouble to go around. So we can all pick something different and still have a lot of work to do. But the more we pick and the more of us who choose each day to do something, things get better. And we know it because we felt it. We have felt it in times of crisis. When people started doing something, we felt a genuine shift in the force. I'm a Trekkie, not a Star Wars person, but we felt a movement in the force. We can feel that again, but we've got to believe that it happens in the times when we're not standing in line to vote. It happens in the times in between and on those days, and the more we make it a part of who we are and what we want, the more often we don't have to worry about it the next day.